Hi all, welcome back to Comparative Politics Online. I'm Professor Michael Wolff. In our last video, we talked about what race was for, what purpose the racial classification of human groups serves for larger society. And we mostly determined that this purpose was to justify exclusion and to systematize an unequal social hierarchy. Thinking about the utility of race in this way then led us to be more skeptical of certain claims about what race is. As I hope to make clear, the essentialist or primordialist argument that race is an observable biological fact and that human behavior and capacity is traceable to one's racial genetics was never based on good science, but was nonetheless broadly accepted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, largely because such a view helped justify the concentration of wealth and power into fewer hands through the exclusion, subjugation, and exploitation of entire populations. Later in the 20th century, constructivist theory helped to undermine arguments for any kind of official sanctioning of racism. That is, if biologically speaking we are, in fact, just one race, there cannot be any rational justification to sanction either inequality or separation based on racial differences. This sea change in the way that we look at race, however, has certainly not put an end to race inequality or racism. And although it did help to get rid of some of the most egregious sins of racism, like those of Jim Crow segregation, for example, in some ways it actually makes it harder to combat these things by blurring racial lines and by giving intellectual license to those who claim race does not actually exist at all. It also begs the question, if race is socially constructed, well, how exactly is it constructed? And can we choose to construct it in ways that are less harmful and more just? Or better yet, can we choose to deconstruct race and discard it altogether? To answer these questions, let's look at how race works in the South American country of Brazil. But first, I want you to think about how you think about race in the United States. What makes someone white or black? What other races are there in the United States? Can you tell somebody's race when you look at them? If so, how? Now, pause the video for a minute and give this some thought. Ready? Okay, now I want you to watch this short video depicting a typical family in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Take note of anything that strikes you as odd or confusing, okay? Here we go.
Meu nome é Simone.
Meu nome é Regina.
Meu nome é Joacinei.
Race, color, identity in Brazil, it's complicated. Even within the same family, how you see yourself and how others see you are not always the same thing. Meet Simone's family. They live in a community on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro.
Meu nome é Rodrigo.
Eu sou Isabelle. Daniele.
Jéssica. Meu nome é Sara. E eu tenho 5 anos e minha idade é 5 anos.
Para mim só existe duas raças, branco ou negro, né? Branca, logicamente, eu não sou, então eu sou negra.
Eu sou branca.
Eu sou preta. Eu me acho preta, mas as pessoas me acham morena.
A minha prima Jéssica é branca, o cabelo dela é liso.
Minha mãe é branca e meu pai era negro.
Meu pai é branco. A minha mãe é preta.
Minha raça é negra.
A minha cor mesmo é marrom bombom, mas como não tem isso, eu sou pardo, né?
Eu acho que o Ney é negro.
Pardo significa ser uma pessoa misturada.
A minha filha é branca, embora ela é misturada. Eu sou negra e o pai dela é branco.
A minha cor é marrom.
Ela é branca pela cor da pele que ela tem.
Por que a sua cor é marrom?
Não sei.
Eu acho que a raça muda a minha vida, acho que desde o início, né? Sou ciente da história toda que eu carrego quando me identifico como negro. O peso que isso tem.
Minha cor nunca influenciou e nem influencia em nada.
Se você tem um aspecto de branco, né, acho que as portas se abrem muito mais facilmente.
Uma parte ruim de ser negra é porque você é classificado pela sua cor, não pelo que você é.
Quando você vai se candidatar a uma vaga de emprego, muitas das vezes você tem as mesmas qualificações ou até maiores do que aquela pessoa branca e as pessoas preferem, né, escolher aquela pessoa branca.
Eu e Simone, minha esposa, nós temos pais preto e branco, mas só que ela tem características maiores da parte preta do que eu. Então, eu transito mais fácil no meio do povo do que ela.
Pelo fato de eu ser negra e as minhas irmãs serem brancas, às vezes quando tinha aquelas brigas, né, às vezes elas me chamavam de neguinha, macaca e aquela coisa da briga ali em si, né, mas na hora eu me sentia mal, mas depois passava.
Que eu me lembro, eu nunca chamei ela de neguinha nem de macaca.
Se eu pudesse, eu não mudaria minha cor.
Não, eu não mudaria minha cor.
Ah, minha cor é linda, né? Ser negro é lindo.
Anything seem strange or confusing? Now, I'm going to just take a gander. For starters, you probably aren't used to biological siblings identifying as separate races, one black and one white. You also might have been surprised at how some people identify themselves racially despite their physical appearance. For example, maybe you identified Simone's husband, Joacine, as black, but he doesn't think so. No, he's milk chocolate brown, if you must refer to his color. Or you might think Simone's niece, Jessica, is neither black nor white, but she says she's black. Meanwhile, her own sister, Daniele, who also identifies as black, insists that Jessica is actually white. I mean, just look at her straight hair. In any case, you hopefully notice that racial identity is far more fluid in Brazil than it is here in the United States. But why is this? And what consequence does this have for politics? Let's briefly compare the histories of the United States and Brazil to see if we can figure this out. In some respects, the two countries are very similar. They're both very big countries, geographically speaking, and both are chock full of natural resources and excellent soil for agriculture. They were both colonized by Europeans between the 16th and the 17th centuries. And in both places, those Europeans soon brought in a great many human captives from Africa to work as slaves in various extractive industries, such as sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton production. Thus, both countries came into existence with substantial populations of Afro-descendant peoples, almost the entirety of whom we consider black today. Yet, despite these similarities, today racial identity and the politics of race plays out in very different ways in Brazil and in the United States. So what led to these divergent paths? Well, there are various components to this answer, so let's try to add them up. First, the Portuguese, who spearheaded the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century, brought a whole lot more African captives to Brazil, about 5 million in total, than those that arrived in the United States, which was around 400,000 to 500,000. This is partly because it was much cheaper to sail directly from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of Brazil than it was to head all the way up to North America. And so the price of slaves in Brazil was far less. But it's also because, unlike colonial England, Portugal's population was too small and too slowly growing for them to send many settlers down to Brazil, who in any case were weary of life in those equatorial climes where white Europeans tended to be highly susceptible to tropical disease. And this meant not only that fewer white settlers made it to Brazil, but also that the great majority of those who did were men. So what do you get as a result? Well, you get lots of what we call miscegenation, or the procreative mixing of supposed race groups, specifically between white Europeans, black Africans, and brown Native Americans. While this did not eliminate the white population altogether, which continued to represent the political and economic elite over various centuries, nor the black population, much of which for centuries continued to be enslaved, it did nonetheless produce a very large population of mixed race peoples who were second-class citizens in some ways, but were non-slave status. By the time Brazil ended slavery in 1888, and when it became a republic in 1891, this mixed race population represented a clear majority of the national population as a whole. Meanwhile, in the United States, the 4 million blacks freed from slavery in 1865 represented only about 10% of the national population. Moreover, although there had been plenty of procreative mixing between blacks and whites in the United States, perhaps mostly through sexual violence, anti-miscegenation laws and a much larger presence of European women in British North America, or early United States, meant that by comparison, human reproduction remained far more racially segregated here in the United States than in Brazil. Okay, now you see that over time, the genetic heritage of Americans and Brazilians moves down different paths, with Brazilians mixing more and Americans mixing less. But there are still large populations of mixed-race people in both of these countries. So why are racial lines so fixed in the United States and so fluid in Brazil? Why would we identify someone with relatively distant African ancestry as black here in the United States, while that same person in Brazil might be identified as white? Well, the most broadly accepted theory today suggests that the answer lies with state policy. As the argument goes, the state makes race and gives it political meaning by first defining what race is, then identifying who belongs to each given racial category through the production of things like census data, and finally by enforcing policy that dictates one's legal status or social status based on racial identification. For instance, in post-Civil War United States, both federal and state level governments passed a great many laws that codified racial classification as a means to separate and exclude non-whites from the privileges of modern society. For example, the Jim Crow laws, but also the anti-miscegenation laws, which in some states continued to be in vigor well into the 1960s. Just think about, for example, the 2016 film Loving. And how was the state to know if people were breaking these laws? What was to prevent a person from identifying as white in order to bypass certain laws that restricted their freedom or access to resources? Well, here's the answer. The one-drop rule. This was codified in the Virginia State Constitution in 1924, and it established that anyone with as much as supposedly one drop of African blood would theretofore be considered black and therefore be legally excludable. Since then, here in the United States, we have essentially imposed a black identity on a highly diverse population of people based on very loose understandings of blood heritage. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the state builders of the last century and a half found it untenable and probably quite dangerous to lump together well over half of the country's population under just one excludable racial epithet. To do so would have put the country's white elite at great risk of race revolution, such as that which took down French colonial rule in Haiti in the early 1800s. To avoid this, state leaders in Brazil intentionally avoided any mention of race at all in the Republican Constitution of 1891. And in the following decades, they went to great lengths to propagate a raceless image of the Brazilian nation. This came to be known as racial democracy, and it implied that the Brazilian state and its people and its nation were so blind to racial distinctions of any kind at all that they were basically immune to the problems of racism like those which have haunted the United States for so long. And so successful was the government's propaganda campaign in the early to mid 20th century that even today, if you were to go visit Brazil, you will likely find very many people who still ascribe to this image of their country. Okay, now we see how racial identification became rigid in the United States and fluid in Brazil. But what impact has this had on politics? A fair comparison would suggest that each system has its pros and its cons. In the United States, the one-drop rule and Jim Crow segregation ensured that racial inequality as a norm would be much more brutally enforced, and also that racial hatreds would become more deeply entrenched in society. By contrast, there is really nothing at all like the KKK or the Aryan Nation in Brazil. However, without lumping such a large and diverse population into one excludable, repressible class of people, it is unlikely we would have seen anything like the national level race-based mobilization to combat systemic injustice as we saw during the civil rights movement back in the 50s and the 1960s, or as in the Black Lives Matter movement today. On the other hand, in Brazil, a clear downside to this myth of racial democracy is this, that it has made it very difficult for any kind of race-based mobilization to occur on a large scale at all, and thus racism and racial exclusion, which are still nonetheless very real, face no significant popular challenge. However, the bright side to racial democracy is that race relations in Brazil tend to be far less imbued with deep hatreds. And social mixing between people of different races is both more common and less awkward. And finally, well, this last one is a bit double-edged perhaps, but for many Brazilians of mixed racial heritage, there's a so-called racial escape hatch, through which they can escape their blackness and reap the social status benefits associated with being white. Of course, not every Brazilian of African descent can escape their blackness. And for them, a society that claims to be colorblind, but that is irrefutably not, leaves little to hope for. Well, there you have it. By comparing two similar countries, we've discovered something interesting about the way race acquires political meaning and how it impacts our political world. We've seen that although the genetic heritage of populations may serve as raw material for social constructions of race, it is really the state that defines race and institutionalizes its meaning for society. And it does this either by creating laws that explicitly classify people by race, or by ignoring race altogether. Now, neither of these paths have succeeded in overcoming racial inequality or racism. So we are left with one final question. Of the two options, what system would you prefer? I'm Professor Michael Wolf, and this is Comparative Politics Online.